to another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me, as always, is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm hot. It's triple digits in Los Angeles at the moment. Thankfully, not when I'm recording this, but yeah, not a huge fan. But besides that, I'm good. I am good. How are you?
I am still healthy and wise, so I'm all right.
Good. Well, today we are continuing our excursion into mixing strategies. We did an episode last week where we talked about when receiving underproduced or overproduced tracks and how to kind of think about that. So today we're talking about if you are receiving poorly recorded or pristinely recorded tracks and how to deal with those in an appropriate manner.
Yes.
When you're getting tracks, I mean, I know you're so busy with your own stuff and the composing and things like that. You're in charge a lot of times of the quality because you're the one recording it.
It's a lucky place to be in, yes.
It is pretty cool. But when you are receiving tracks from outside artists, how many times do you find that there are really poorly recorded, or do you get the majority of them being like, you know what, no, this sounds great, we're good to go here type of thing?
10% of the time, maybe? Not very often.
10% bad?
Yeah, it's not very often.
Okay.
And I think part of that is a fee structure that I have that generally tends to weed out the people that aren't ready yet kind of thing.
Right, okay.
That's the best way I could say it.
That's a very real thing, right?
Sure.
And because, you know, you want to be delicate when you say that, but it's like there's only so much you could do with certain tracks. And if you have a certain pricing structure, you tend to not get those perhaps as much. What would you say, like, what qualifies as poorly recorded to you?
The most obvious is somebody who has very limited recording experience and is attempting to record their magnum opus that they have been working on for, 5 years, and decided to record it themselves in various bedrooms or dens or living rooms, what have you, in whatever locations they've been in when they have the inspiration to record.
Sure.
There is the last example that I can think of this where I got these kind of tracks was about 3 years ago. The vocals were recorded in multiple different spots in 2 different bedrooms, which led to the vocals being very, very non-consistent in the quality of their EQ just in the room that were done in, the rooms that they were done in.
You could really tell that they were
it was obvious.
Different spots.
Very different spots.
Was there at least the same mic?
Yeah, I believe the mic was the same, but because of the location being changed and the way it was recorded, it was a chore.
Yeah.
To get it as
sort
consistently to get it as consistent as possible throughout the nature of the entire song. It was a chore, and I did it specifically because it was a friend of mine, and that's the only reason why I took that gig. If it had been somebody else, they wouldn't have been able to afford the fee, and there's no way I would have actually taken the gig on to start.
Yeah.
I mean, he got lucky because I understand how to get that as consistent as possible with what the source material was. But yeah.
Yeah. When I'm thinking about this, poorly recorded, there's a lot of tools that we have available today. So this is probably less problematic these days if you have a little bit of knowledge about how to work your gear and stuff. But things that I tend to notice is things being recorded too hot. And I'm not talking now.
Oh, yeah, distortion in the signal itself. There's literally nothing you can do about that.
Yeah. So I'm not talking here again just to like, record at -18. No, I'm talking about actually just clipping the signal going in, right?
Or just blowing through the red and right off the top.
Yeah, and those are difficult things. Other things could be where It's a live drum kit that you receive to do, and they've done. And not everybody's great at this, and certainly nobody's great at it right off the bat. Sometimes you feel like a kit could be like there's nothing but leakage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's very little definition, and those things can be very, very challenging. We have to have a discussion here, obviously, with a client when we get these tracks. It's like, look, because sometimes these things can be done on purpose, right, to have a certain aesthetic and
Sure.
things. To let them know, and I think this is also one of those cases where it's somebody who's new at recording and they're doing their best and they don't understand why it's not going to sound like a Fleetwood Mac album.
Sure.
You know, right? So it's like, look, this is what you have and this is what we can do with it. It can still be cool, but you're not getting like a Mutt Lange production out of something that you recorded on your boom box. You know what I mean?
Right. And that is the discussion that I've had with people that I've taken on those kind of gigs with. It's rare for me to do that now. It is the discussion that I have to let them know this is the realities of what can be done and what can't be done.
Yeah.
And then they have to accept that.
Yeah,
not.
and I think that's, sometimes, again, I guess, like, that's an aesthetic that they're going for.
If
Let's
it
say,
is,
for
yeah,
example,
sure.
Right.
Sometimes
but let's say
they're
that
not.
sometimes it's not. I've been there. It's like, recorded some horrible sounding tracks, right? But that's how you learn. It's like, maybe that was a bad idea. Don't do that again or try to get better at this or whatever. Over-processing tracks on the way in is another big one. Right?
Sure.
If they don't need it. And it's like, I got my new vocal preamp. Let's really EQ the snot and compress the snot out of the vocal here, right? I was like, ooh, maybe you overcooked that a little bit. But anyway, rambling here. But sometimes it's done on purpose, right? And it can be really cool. Now, there's a little bit of a loaded statement here, but let's say, like, an example where this is just like supremely cool to me would be like Sabotage from the Beastie Boys.
Yep.
Now that's a dirty, gritty kind of sounding song. Right?
It is. And the value of how they recorded it works extremely well for what they did.
Exactly. So it's like, it fits that. That would sound really out of place if it was made to sound like Roxy Music. It's like that's not right. So it's not like it's necessarily a straight, narrow divide between like good and bad. It's just different aesthetics. If we receive poorly recorded tracks, it's like, it can be pulling teeth if that's not what they're going for.
Sure.
So we've had the discussion with the client, and we're saying that this is not going to sound like a Steely Dan or a Fleetwood Mac record, but we can make a lo-fi awesome track. So what kind of stuff would you do if you're receiving those and they're like, yeah, cool, we want to get some kind of like indie kind of vibe on this. So what do you tend to focus on?
If that was the direction after talking to the client and explaining the realities of what was going on, I would be looking at using additional distortion plugins to enhance the distortion that may already be there, to kind of disguise it, essentially.
Yeah.
Because usually poorly recorded distortion is exactly that, poorly recorded distortion, and you need to hide that kind of stuff. Unless it was done on purpose in a way that actually sounds cool. Most of the time when it's done by somebody green, it's not so cool. I would also think about how the compression would work, not only on the individual parts, but on the entire overall thing to really rein it in a way that you don't get the huge peaks and valleys that tend to come along with poorly recorded source audio, so that it sounds a bit more quote unquote consistent across the board. That's a tough thing to do. The other thing to do, especially if I'm giving guitars that weren't really well recorded and they're electric, I can reamp those things and make them sound somewhat better than the original signal.
Assuming that you have a DI.
Yeah. Well, no, not even with a DI. I've done it with guitars that were already amped and they just sounded wrong.
Oh, have you now?
Oh, yeah.
That's
and
interesting.
Just run it through an amp sim and a new cabinet with mic and get a more analog-y vibe out of it because the digital version that was sent is just wretched, and wretched to the point of unsalvageability if you don't do something of that nature. So reamping in a situation that isn't technically reamping, it's just running it's running the already amped guitar sound through a new amp and cabinet to try and salvage it kind of thing. I've done that too. Oftentimes as well in situations like this, it's someone who doesn't understand the timing factor of what happens between instruments. And so things sound very loose, and the discussion performance-wise. So you have to have the discussion of, is it okay to clean up the timing a bit to make it sound like this is done by people that know what they're doing? And sometimes they want that, sometimes they don't. And in most cases, when I've done the client discussion with that, they're not aware of it until it's brought to their attention, and then they realize, oh, yeah, well, maybe we can clean up the timing too. So that becomes part of the factor of doing that.
And when you're doing something in that vein where the timing between instruments, the performance wise, right? Do you generally just touch parts where they're just out of sync with each other, or do you go even further as to sort of like really focus on a quantizing kind of thing? Because I think that if you're going that far, we might lose the patient a little bit of what it is that we're doing here as well. So if there are hits, let's say that the bass is hitting and it's late and the guitar is early or whatever, I would pull those together so they work with the drums, as opposed to, well, the tempo's 134, let's make everything on the grid type of thing.
I've done it both ways. The last example of me doing it, which was probably 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago maybe, the entire band played at the same time, sans click track.
Okay.
And they still weren't technically locked into each other. It was a relative time value, but it was the kind of thing that I would call the locomotive vibe that needed to be there. And the locomotive vibe was being lost all over the place just because of the nature of how it was played. The drummer didn't understand how to play to a click, and the rest of the band couldn't lock into him anyway. So that required figuring out tempo, putting it to a somewhat of a grid, and quantizing to the bar is what I did for the vast majority of it. So it didn't lose a lot of the interplay in the middle, so to speak, but at least at the bar front and ends, it was synced up. And once I did that for the drums, which were fortunately recorded in MIDI,
nice,
using a MIDI drum kit, it made it much easier to lock the rest of it in. And once I had that, it made it even easier to do the slap back audio value that everything needed for that particular vibe of that kind of genre that it was. Because when you have a slapback that's working in, I don't want to call it hillbilly, but definitely just kind of a Johnny Cash type thing where he's got that locomotive train drum beat going, and there's the slapback going on most of the instrumentation to give it that old schooly vibe. You need to have that timing working for that slapback to work.
Yeah.
And that was the nature of that particular song that I'm referring to, is it needed that. And it took a little while.
So it sounds like it was a lot of work. It was not only with the quality of the recordings, but the performance as well.
Right. Well, and the interesting thing is, after it was finished, the only person that hated it was the drummer.
Oh,
was the drummer. Everybody else and all the friends and family and consumers that they were trying to entice with the song thought it sounded light years better afterwards, except for the drummer.
This is another topic, but that can be very bruising for the ego for somebody when you got the spotlight shown on you, and it's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but this is what you're doing, buddy. To go back a little bit more onto the sound and not so much the performance of the song or the tracks, I would kind of go along with you where I say that I think more of the vibe right? So, I'm thinking possibly not a whole lot of high end, top end that might be, filtering stuff out. I've done the trick that you kind of mentioned there, where one thing that I've done with those vocals that have been clipping is to sort of accentuate the mess that is there, the error, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's clipping, just just squash that thing, with compression and stuff, and add some more grittiness. So you're almost like decorating the mistakes that are there to kind of make them sound almost like they're on purpose,
Yep.
instead of trying to hide them, reinforce them to make sure that they sound gritty all the way through now.
Well, and that would hark back to your example of Sabotage by the Beastie Boys. I would go so far as to say that they ran those rap vocals that they did through maybe a rat pedal or some other distortion pedal to keep the distortion consistent.
It could be. And this is, one of those cases where it's like it just sounds great. It almost has this like yelling through a megaphone type of a sound, but I don't think that's what it is, but it has that really just chaotic kind of vibe. It works so great for that track, I think. So when you get poorly recorded tracks, that's the way that you have to go. It's like just make it cool. Lots of tape emulation and things like that to really give it some interest sonically. It's not pretty, but it's cool. It doesn't have to be necessarily like the first Burzum black metal album, right? Where that's a whole other story. But make it sound cool. And of course, the arrangement has to work as well.
Yep.
When we're doing this, right? We talked about that last week, how to kind of like have interesting parts happen, even if there's not a whole lot of parts going on. So making sure that's interesting and making it sound like vibey, so it's just kind of like dripping with attitude.
Other things that can lend itself to vibe, as you mentioned here, is using echoes, slapbacks, delays, maybe flanging and phasing effects as well. If they're not too over, maybe they need to be over the top. It just depends on the song and what you're getting.
Yeah. Absolutely. If we're going to go overboard hard to kind of make it. Let's flip the coin. What if we're getting pristinely recorded tracks where you kind of like, you pull it up and everything's just like, oh my God, this sounds freaking amazing already. What am I going to do?
You still have to have the discussion with the client of what they want.
Sure.
There's no getting around that. It's how things get done in the world of being the mix engineer. You need to understand what the client is going for. As an example of hearing something that you pull up and everything, faders are all at zero and it still sounds pretty darn awesome. The first time I heard that was getting the raw multitracks of Walk This Way by Aerosmith. It was interesting, and that's where I've mentioned this on the podcast before, that I got the minus 18 dB thing. Everything was right there, leveled to
there
where
it is. There's the record.
There's the record, and you almost had to do nothing. It was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
To hear that in that state. And that's essentially what we would look at in this quote-unquote pristinely recorded situation. If you're getting tracks from, say, Al Schmidt, which obviously you can't do anymore, but you know that what he's recorded already is going to sound pretty darn good with all the faders at zero, because that's how the man recorded. He was a master at setting the microphone in the right damn spot in the room to capture whatever instrument it was. You can still apply that concept to things that are recorded with soft synths and virtual instruments as well, and amp sims and whatnot. You have to apply that same knowledge. Well, you don't have to. I take that back. You don't have to apply that knowledge, but it certainly helps. And you can get a long way towards helping the mix engineer, if you are the recording engineer, to having an easier life if you've recorded things well.
Yeah. What's the saying? Like, record like there's no mixing and mix like there's no mastering.
Something like that,
right?
yeah.
For me, I think one of the things can be actually the hardest thing when we get these pristinely sounding tracks is to still assume that, oh, I have to make sure that I still do a lot, right? I have to dig in. And it's like, okay, you start pulling up compressors and EQs, but realizing you might not have to do a whole lot at all. And it's instead better to sort of focus on the little details and just make these little things shine. We talked about overproduced tracks last week and how it can sometimes be really, really dense because there's things going on. We've also talked on the podcast here about how some emulations and some gear can impart just a couple of percentage points of improvement over what it is that you might have.
Sure.
When you have tracks like this, that's what you could focus on. You just got to make that just a little bit better. To me, it's like focusing on things like reverb times and how long they decay and those things, right? Making sure that all of that is dialed in. You got your Abbey Road trick on your reverb return or whatever, right? Filtering that everything sounds really, really good. Tossing in some ear candy, perhaps, right? Where there's like, oh, I'm going to be real fancy and do a delay throw on this word over here, The little details that start to kind of shine when the track itself is already sounding really, really good.
Yeah. And to that end, you're saying know when not to do stuff and don't feel like you have to constantly do stuff. It's a nice feeling when you get tracks like this, where all you have to do is just pull up your console and not necessarily need to tweak any high-end EQ or low-end EQ or even mids. You don't even have to touch EQ. You don't have to touch the compressor because the tracks are already sitting the way they should. And it's a great thing. Generally speaking, it's much easier to do that when the entire band or a vast majority of it has been tracked all at once. Mainly the reason why is because when you're doing everything individually, sure, you can control it all, but it's not necessarily been arranged to an extent where everything is sitting in its own place already. But when you have the entire band set up and you've got everything in the console and everybody's just milling about and you're getting ready to hit that record button because you got your vocal level, you got your guitar levels, you got your synth levels, you got your drums and your bass levels and everything kind of going. It's already set up for the recording engineer having already gotten a level on the band in and of itself when everybody's at once. When it's not everybody at once, I don't think that same attitude is always approached, where this is the immediate volume level, EQ, possible compression on that record button.
Could be. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that point. I get what you're saying, but I think you can still have that mindset even if you're tracking everything individually. I think it comes down to how well produced the track is, in the sense that this is how the pieces are going to fit together. I think you could probably get that in the same way, even if you're tracking individually. That also depends a little bit on what kind of music it is. Like, let's say that you're doing more of a funk or a jazz thing where you have that interplay between musicians. They're in the same room and they can look at each other, and I think you can get the magic that way.
Sure.
That it's definitely lost, obviously, if we're doing it individually. I think the restraint from just kind of like automatically just digging in and adding EQ and compression, because I think that's such a big part of people's workflow.
It's a huge part of it. That's why I'm saying the individual multi-track type stuff tends to lend itself to needing more of that, whereas a lot of things that are done as the entire band is off the cuff live with a recording engineer that's competent, you don't need to do that as much because it's already been done on the way in for the most part.
Could be. I'm not going to fight you on it, but just
I'm not saying it can't be done with individual multi-tracks. I'm just saying it's less likely to be as easy.
Let's say that I think it comes down to the preparation that goes into it.
Yeah.
As we're doing the recording of the individual tracks.
And speaking of preparation, let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
I saw something from Softtube, Swedish developer, do a lot of good stuff. And they have now come out with a new synth, and I have a soft spot in my heart for soft synths and generally things of the emulation kind of thing. But they have now what they call the Model 77, which is an emulation of the Yamaha CS80, which is the sort of like uber expensive keyboard if you can find them. And if you're thinking like Blade Runner or any of like the Vangelis stuff, that was his main work for. So now they have one of those, and I've been playing with it a little bit, and it's pretty cool. I mean, I like soft synths. So this Friday, I'm going to go for the Soft Tube Model 77 as my find for this Friday. What do you got, Jody?
I'm going to go in the same sort of vein as you did. I am looking at the Venus Theory free plugin series that he's doing with Arturia. He has released something called Ara's Polyscape, which, as he's calling it, a collection of deep and cinematic sounds that were crafted with the Arturia Polybrute 12 synthesizer. So if you're a fan of Venus Theory, as Chris tends to be, then you want to get the Venus Theory free plugin with Arturia. That is my find for this week.
Cool. Yeah, it's for the decent sampler as well. Just want to throw that out there so that it's a free sampler. That's what it works in. So cool stuff from Venus Theory. And like you said, I am a huge fan. So
right. While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. We'll make sure that you don't miss any future episodes of this incredible podcast. And since you're on our email list, you'll automatically be entered to any future giveaways that we have. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word pristine, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you later, Jody.